Welcome, as I said, to this webinar, Ethical Leadership. Is the time always right to do the right thing, right? And it's quite timely. This continues to remain in the space of discussion in the public sector. And so we are so privileged to have you all here today. I am privileged to have with us this morning our CEO, Dr. Ruby Brown, as well as our esteemed presenter, Professor Trevor Monroe. Just going to alert you to a few protocols before I hand over to Dr. Ruby Brown. Please, we ask that you keep your mics on mute, right? We will have a question and answer segment towards the end. However, I invite you as the presentation goes along to capture your questions in the chat feature. Those questions will be monitored, and at the appointed time, we will field those questions, okay? So once again, keep your mics on mute, and we ask that you keep your cameras off until at the appointed time where you want to ask a question towards the end, okay? So without much further ado, I am going to invite Dr. Ruby Brown to bring us opening remarks.
Good morning, public sector colleagues. Our presenter, Professor Trevor Monroe, members of the MIND team, welcome. Welcome to another in the series of MIND's Leadership Development webinars. It was in June last year that we launched the Leadership Development webinar series, shortly after we had been plunged into the COVID-19 pandemic. We wanted to have this intervention provide a platform for engaging you with our variety of relevant and current leadership development issues. Yes, we wanted to engage you in discourse so that together we could exchange ideas, provide new insights, and contribute to a forward-thinking leadership community. Yes, as we sought to keep step with the prevailing environment, we thought this was absolutely necessary. Well, today's webinar, as you're aware, addresses the issue of ethical leadership. And the fact that you are present on this platform is for us an indication that you deem this a most important and timely issue for us to engage in dialogue. Notwithstanding, I would want to think that we each might have a different reason for the importance we place on this issue. It might be for the reason that as a public sector leader, or for that matter, as public sector leaders, we define ourselves as professionals. Yes, professionals having high regard for personal and professional ethics, integrity, and trustworthiness. Consequently, we feel much hurt when one of us is labeled as unethical or lacking in integrity and trust. However, as I gave further consideration to all of the other possible reasons that might have sparked our interest in this issue, I couldn't help but reflect on a research I completed back in 2013. In this research, I identified lack of integrity and ethics as one of the factors contributing to public sector leaders across the region experiencing a phenomena for which I coined the expression professional hurt. Those leaders who participated in my research, they shared stories of the mental and emotional pain they encountered during their experiences. Experiences, they said, that violated their professional dignity, and the pain that attended a certain feeling that they had lost their claims to and respect as professionals and as leaders. As these leaders spoke of the ethical dilemmas they saw and felt, here are two of the comments they made. Professional ethics did not apply there, and even personal ethics had failed. Mark you, we are talking about our public sector leaders from across the region. And not a comment, questionable ethical standards abound. Well, as the government of Jamaica's Public Sector Management Training and Leadership Development Institute, mind is committed. Yes, we are committed to doing our part in engendering an ethics and integrity ethos in support of a culture of good governance throughout our public sector. And it is really this commitment that drives our leadership development webinar series. And in fact, it drives all our other leadership development interventions. And we know this is a commitment that you too share. And so we are very confident that today you will benefit greatly from Professor Monroe's rich experiences, his research and analysis of local, regional, and international trends in ethics and integrity in public sector environments. We are therefore quite confident that when you leave this platform a little later this morning, you will be doing so also feeling confident that you are now even more able to successfully navigate any ethical dilemma you may face as you lead in the public sector. So, on behalf of the MIND team, I extend to you once again our warmest welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown. You certainly set the context for this morning's webinar, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Before I get into introducing our presenter, just want to let you know, participants, those of you who are on as your phone name, Galaxy, AJ, and so on, we're asking you to just hover over your name, click more, and rename yourself. This is for purposes of capturing you in our participants register, okay? Also, if you're on as an abbreviation, just capture your full name. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce our presenter, Professor Trevor Monroe. Professor Trevor Monroe is the Principal Director of National Integrity Action, Jamaica's chapter of Transparency International, and has been appointed a member of the International Council of Transparency International, one of only 30 globally, and the only such from the Caribbean. Professor Monroe has a distinguished record as an academic in civil society advocacy and in public service. As an academic, he has authored or co-authored 9 books and a number of publications on Caribbean democratic governance and received many awards. These include the Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence, the Mona Principal's Award for Research, 2 Fulbright Fellowships taken up at Harvard University in the United States, and an honorary doctorate in the social sciences from Florida International University, the first person from the English-speaking Caribbean to receive such an award. After gaining a first-class honors degree and a master's in government from UWI, Dr. Monroe was awarded the Jamaican Rhodes Scholarship and attained his PhD in political science from Oxford University. In September 2013, Professor Monroe was the only person from the Caribbean invited to speak at the 110th anniversary of the Rhodes Scholarships, celebrated at Oxford University. As a civil society advocate, Professor Monroe was instrumental as founder/co-founder of a number of organizations, including the Citizens Action for Free and Fair Elections, CAFE, and the Jamaica Civil Society Coalition in 2010. He has delivered keynote presentations in most CARICOM states. In the sphere of public service, Professor Monroe, on the nomination of then Prime Minister Patterson, served in Jamaica's Senate for 10 years, championing legislation for greater transparency, accountability, and good governance. He has served as consultant to the World Bank, USAID, UK DFID, the UNDP, UNESCO, the OAS, and the Carter Center. He is currently a member of the National Council of the Partnership for Prosperous Jamaica, now chaired by Prime Minister Holness. Previously, he served on Jamaica's National Security Council on the invitation of then Prime Minister Golding. In Jamaica's 2015 National Honors, Professor Monroe was awarded the Order of Distinction Commander Class. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I present to you Professor Trevor Monroe.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much, Georgia, for those kind words of introduction. I almost didn't recognize myself as you proceeded. Thank you very, very much. And thank you, Ruby, for your welcome and opening remarks, which set the context for our conversation today. And may I also join in congratulating the MIND for the leadership webinar series, very important and very timely. Our topic this afternoon, or rather this morning, we're not in the afternoon yet, as I welcome all of you, senior and middle managers of the public sector, is the time always right to do the right thing. I shall pursue my presentation through a number of sections. First, I'll make some introductory remarks. Then we will provide some definitions, important definitions, and then talk a little bit about the challenges, the general challenges, not just for public sector managers, in doing the right thing. Then I want to deal specifically with what is right in the public service. Laws, the rules and codes, not of course all of them, but enough to give us some indication. I want to then look at some of the case studies of wrongs, and related to that, public perception of our public sector or senior public officers. Most of all, I want to talk about going forward. How do we get it right or get it more right than we have done so far? And then I'll make some concluding remarks and look forward to your questions and your comments with great interest. So that's what we hope to cover this morning. And I'm seeing where we are having the poll up. I don't know if Georgia wants to present the results of our poll, or that happen later on in our presentation.
Okay, so I've launched a poll. You're just to respond whether true or false to just 3 questions. Question 1 is currently on the screen. I will give you a few seconds before I move on to the next question. Okay, so under the Integrity Commission Act, the declarant or public servant is required to state the market value of his or her property, not the purchase price. Right now we have 70% persons saying true and 30% saying false.
Well, I'm happy to say that the minority is not often correct, but in this case, they are. The Integrity Commission Act requires you to declare both the market value as well as the purchase price, so that they discern the difference between where you were, the property value at the outset, and later on the market value, to see to what extent you may have used your position to perhaps sponsor development in the area which would have improved the market value. So, minority correct, and as is often the case in my experience.
Okay, the second question is up. Jamaica's Official Secrets Act became law prior to independence. Please indicate true or false. Okay, our results show 37% indicated true and 63% indicated false.
Clearly, this is a morning for the minority. Remember that so many of our movements in Jamaica which have achieved positive results started with a few people. In this case, the minority is correct. Jamaica Official Secrets Act was actually passed into law in 1911. Can you imagine that? So it's true that it became law prior to independence.
Okay, and our final poll question. Under staff orders for Jamaica's public service, public servants are prohibited from engaging in private work. Okay, there are results.
Now the majority has it. The staff orders allow public servants to engage in private work with permission. So it's false to say that it's not true to say that they are prohibited from engaging in private work. So congratulations to the majority and earlier on the minority. Thank you very much for those poll results, Jojo.
You're welcome, Prof.
In my introductory remarks, I would like to, first of all, thank the MIND for giving me this opportunity to present to senior and middle managers in our public service. And I'm happy for this opportunity for really two reasons. You and your predecessors, whatever negatives may have been expressed, with whatever degree of justification, you and your predecessors have made a sterling contribution to a Jamaica which, despite crises, has made a sterling contribution to the global community. We're one of the very, very few countries who have enjoyed constitutional rule unbroken over 75 years without assassination of leaders, presidents, such as happened in the United States, without one-party rule, such as happened in so many of the countries which gained independence about the same time as Jamaica, like Nigeria, Ghana a few years before, without civil war of the kind that scarred Sri Lanka and so many other countries. So we have much to be thankful for in that relative stability. Not only that, we have, and we should recall these in moments of crisis and sometimes despair. We have many firsts that the global community would do well to emulate. We were the very first predominantly Black country to gain adult suffrage in 1944. In the 70s, we had perhaps among the worst electoral systems in the world. In the 2000 and beyond, we're among the best with our Electoral Commission of Jamaica. We're the first in the Caribbean to develop campaign finance regulations. And of course, our women, typified by our CEO today and our manager of the leadership program, have made great strides from the days when my mother and her family could not rise above the lowest levels in the public service. Now our women The majority of judges or permanent secretaries indeed have done much to achieve gender equity in a world which still discriminates against women. So I want to acknowledge, first of all, your role in this important journey that Jamaica has been undergoing. I associate myself with the remarks made by Stephen Williams, the clerk of the courts in the Trelawney Parish Court, as he accepted the Civil Servant of the Year award, one of 3 in 2020, where he saluted, and I join him, in members of the civil service who have toiled continuously, often devoid of any acknowledgements, working in less than ideal environments, but continue to give of their best, end of quotes. I salute you. The second reason I'm happy for this opportunity to address you, senior and middle-level civil servants, is because of my own family. The influence of those who socialized me in those early years provided a foundation without which I would not be speaking with you today about doing the right thing. I think of my father, who toiled for 30-odd years in the colonial civil service before becoming Jamaica's second director of public prosecutions in independence. My mother and my aunt would not rise above a lowly level in the postal service at that time. My uncles, again, laboring in the vineyard, ultimately becoming, after independence, Commissioner of Income Tax in one case, and in another, Accountant General. So I give thanks for their upbringing. I give thanks on this occasion for their teaching, and not only teaching, but ensuring that I did the right thing. And there are many stories which can be told on another occasion when I strayed from the straight and narrow path, and I can tell you on another occasion what the consequences were. So I'm happy for this occasion. We're speaking about ethical leadership. And therefore, it's important for us to begin with some clear definitions of what we're really speaking about. First of all, ethics. It's important to ponder what ethics means. It's a deep, but not just only a deep, a practical understanding of the difference between right and wrong, of how to resolve ethical dilemmas, to make choices between my immediate self-interest, which all of us are tempted to give a priority, and the wider public interest, to recognize and stand against injustice and uphold integrity and fair play. So that's what ethics is. Leadership is the ability to persuade others, to influence others, to guide others to a higher level. Not just to do what people want, which very often is at a lower level, but to guide others to a higher level, as much by your deeds as by your words, by what your practice is as by what you preach. To empathize with and to connect with, never to disrespect followership, even when engaged in wrongs, but to correct that which is negative with patience and with understanding. With such definitions, it would seem obvious that clearly it's always the right time to do the right thing. But as each of us know in reflecting on our own experience, there are very, very serious challenges in doing the right thing. It's very often easier said than done. In fact, the life of the person from whom we derive the question in today's presentation typifies the difficulty of the choice. It was Martin Luther King, Jr., who said, "The time is always right to do the right thing. But look at the story of his life. He could have chosen to go along with the racism in the United States at the time. So many did. He could have chosen to have a relatively easy life for himself and his family. But Martin Luther King chose to do the right thing, to stand up for what is appropriate, for equality, for civil rights. And by that choice, he suffered persecution, imprisonment, and ultimately assassination for the choice that he made. Of course, arising from that choice, he is now regarded as a national and international hero. And while that story is extreme, because it presents a choice between basically survival and being eliminated, it does present the difficulty of choosing between what is easy and what is hard. What is easy, going along with the crowd, doing the wrong, and what is hard, making the right choice. This confronts all of us, whether uptown or downtown, whether managers in the civil service, private sector. And I wanted to make reference to a youngster by the name of Jabari Williams. Many of you, in fact, most of you, all of you would not have known his name. His name always sticks in my mind. Jabari Williams is a youngster, 19 years old, who lived in inner city Kingston, in fact, on Kidd Lane. And like so many in those circumstances, Jabari lived in circumstances of poverty, had a job which paid very little. One day he found a bag with $100,000. $100,000. He could have chosen to keep that $100,000 to alleviate the conditions of his parents, himself, his colleagues. But Jabari Williams made the choice of trying to find the owners of that bag, and he did. And he returned the $100,000 to the owners. His peers around him cursed him. He's an idiot, a fool. Look what we could have done with that. But he returned that money. And subsequently, when the story broke, he became a celebrity. NIA awarded him an integrity award. UTEC recognized him specially, and Sagicor came, provided him a scholarship which allowed him to develop his particular skill as a baker. When asked, how come you made that choice? Jabari's reply, my mother would have not expected me to do otherwise. And here we see quite clearly a case where immediate gratification was subordinated to doing the right thing. We see a case where a youngster, like many of us in an older generation, would have been imbued with traditional values. Honesty is the best policy. Cost it what it will. As against secular, rational values, which have become dominant in so many countries around the world, including Jamaica, which ultimately means me first, me second, and me third. Secular, rational values. And of course, because of the dominance of those values now, you as managers, myself, whether public sector or private sector or academic, are very much in an environment where we can be infected by the me first as against the traditional values, honesty, integrity, is the best thing. So, in going forward, we have to recall and recover those values, particularly through our religious convictions, being our brother's keeper, doing unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But in the public sector, we have to do much more than refurbish those foundations. We have to learn what is the right thing. And we learn that by refamiliarizing ourselves, please excuse me, in the public service with the laws, the rules, and the codes which apply to our particular situation. In that regard, those who are familiar, I apologize to remind you, those who are not, then you should be. I remind you of some of the codes which are set out in our staff orders, firstly. In the first instance, the staff orders, and the next slide indicates the service standards. In those service standards, we see a number of imperatives which allow us to do the right thing. Treat everyone with courtesy, respect, fairness, and objectivity. Many of you know how difficult that is. When you are treated with disrespect, when you are treated unfairly. But that's the imperative in doing the right thing. Do not return wrong with wrong, but return it with rightful behavior. In the exercise of official duties, our service standards continue. No officer shall confer any special benefits and/or preferential treatment on the basis of any special relationship. And of course, by special relationship, that includes a relative, it includes someone who may have done you a favor and you feel some need to treat that person specially as against the ordinary individual. Again, difficult choice, but the right thing requires you not to confer any special benefit or preferential treatment on the basis of any special relationship. Then there's a vexed issue of political activity in a country where, despite the fact that increasing majorities are regrettably not voting and don't see why they should vote, partisanship remains quite strong. In doing the right thing in our public service, it is quite clear that we ourselves cannot only not engage in partisan politics, but beyond that, in the exercise of official duties, no service or benefit should be denied or provided to anyone on the basis of partisan political affiliation. No advantage in the award of a contract or disadvantage in the award of a contract because of the contractor's political affiliation. Similarly, promotion or the lack of promotion. Extremely important to preserve that neutrality and impartiality which lies at the heart of the governance arrangements in the Westminster model, even the export version, which we have here in Jamaica. Then, the exercise of managerial authority. Managers like yourselves are expected to exercise authority fairly and even-handedly. Whether you like someone or you don't, for whatever reason, that should not impact your evaluation of their performance and the use of your authority in relation to that particular individual. There's also a punitive dimension, that managers who are found to be vindictive in the exercise of authority shall be subject to disciplinary measures. And later on in this presentation, we're going to see one or two examples where it appears, at least to one looking on from the outside, that there is a vindictive exercise of authority. So these are some of the requirements in our staff orders, and we go on to some others. Gifts and exchanges. Officers in their personal, in their official capacity are forbidden to solicit or to receive gifts or gratuities for the performance or neglect of official duties and responsibilities. This one, of course, presents us often with some challenges when a particular client may be so pleased and happy with the service that has been provided that they may wish to give a gift, but you yourself may be tempted to solicit a gift for performing a particularly complicated operation. And that too presents real challenges because it borders on bribery, it borders on corruption. We come now to a particularly difficult one in a context of transparency as an imperative. And not only transparency, but one in which we all can be proud that Jamaica is one of the leaders in the world. We come in the top 10 of 190 countries, ahead of the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, when it comes to freedom of the press. But in respect of the staff orders, permanent secretaries and heads of departments must ensure that mechanisms and procedures are in place to facilitate transparency, to facilitate access to information consistent with government policy, which then leads to the obverse of that. Any material, statement, documents, or other forms of communication for publication in any media must be approved by the permanent secretary, head of department, or other authorized personnel. Of course, some challenges arise there. What happens if the statement or document or other form of communication is pointing to some wrongdoing by the persons who must approve before it is released to the media? An issue that we shall discuss a little more as we go through this presentation. So we not only have the staff orders, but we have to know, we have to learn what is the right thing from some of the critical laws which operate in Jamaica. And I want to mention 4 or 5 of them. Not to go through them in any detail, but to bring them to your attention as legislation that you should familiarize yourself with, because they may ultimately challenge you in your day-to-day exercise of managerial authority. The first one, which we referred to in the poll at the outset of this presentation, the Official Secrets Act of 1911. It may surprise you, but it is true. This law was never debated in the Jamaican Parliament, but it was sailed, the term used in our Constitution, as one of the laws which operated during the pre-independence colonial period. That law criminalizes communication of information by any public servant of a certain quality. And it remains on the books in its original form, despite being repealed or amended in so many other jurisdictions. In fact, quite interestingly, in the United Kingdom itself, which is the colonial power that originated that law, this law has been amended several times since 1911 to make it more flexible and less draconian. It has been repealed in other jurisdictions which were colonies at the time, but it remains on our books. So much so, this anomaly. The Prime Minister Bruce Golding, it was in 2011, indicated, quotes, such legislation has no place in independent Jamaica, end of quotes. And that view has been shared. In fact, it was not only shared, but it was approved by a joint select committee of Parliament, which at the time was considering the Access to Information Act, how should it be reviewed and strengthened? And it was recommended 10 years ago that this legislation from colonial times ought to be repealed. But it is still there. Then there is an act, a law, which runs in the opposite direction and obviously presents dilemmas to those who have to examine both and apply them. The Access to Information Act, 2004. I remember this law very well because I was serving in the Senate at the time. And that act, one of them, where Jamaica was a leader in the region, states a very clear objective: to reinforce and give further effect to fundamental principles, not just principles, fundamental principles underlying the system of constitutional democracy. Namely, that should be namely, not mainly, government accountability, transparency, by granting the public a general right of access to official documents held by public authorities. Of course, when you go through the act, you will see that there are exemptions related to matters connected to national security, matters connected to sensitive economic information, etc. But the main point is that this law grants a general right of access so that any member of the public or the media can apply to any department, ministry, or agency for access to an official document, and it must be granted unless there's some special reason to not deny access. And if that access is denied, then there's an appeal procedure, which in effect does work and has been used effectively from time to time. So the Access to Information Act is very important for managers or middle managers or senior managers in particular to be aware of and to apply in circumstances where it is justified. The next piece of legislation, unfortunately in my view, is among Jamaica's best kept secrets. It's the Protected Disclosures Act of 2011, otherwise called Whistleblower Protection. What this law seeks to do, it's objective, and I mentioned two as stated in the Act, to facilitate, and not just to facilitate, to encourage the making of disclosures of improper conduct in the public interest. And beyond encouraging the making of disclosures, Objective 3C, to protect employees who may make specified disclosures from being subjected to occupational detriment, end of quotes. Well, that's a big highfalutin phrase to mean protect them from victimization, because what they're doing is the right thing, disclosing improper conduct, which the law encourages under this Protected Disclosures Act. And you can well see in so many countries, including our own, it is public servants at your level, at lower levels, who see wrongs and who do not keep quiet, that allows the citizens and the authorities to correct what ought not to be taking place and to expose wrongs that needed to be righted. Of course, this law needs to be strengthened in many ways. One of the ways, of course, is to make people aware of it. And secondly, of course, to strengthen the protection that is provided. Then there's the Procurement Act, 2015. In fact, while the law was passed in 2015, the regulations were not developed until 2019, and therefore the law only came into effect in 2019. This is a particularly important act in a context where, and I remind you, between April 2019 and March 2020, ministries, departments, and agencies, somewhere in the region of the public bodies in particular, 140 out of them, awarded some 21,000 contracts. And the value of the contracts so awarded, public money, was over 137 billion, B-I-L-L-I-O-N, dollars. And hence you can understand the importance of the Procurement Act. Objective C, obtain value for money in public procurement. Promote integrity and engender public confidence in the public procurement process. And, very importantly, provide for the fair and equitable treatment of persons participating .
Trevor, Prof, you're muted. We're not hearing you.
How long has that been happening?
Just about 15 seconds or so.
Oh, 15 seconds. Well, that's not too bad. I got scared for a moment. That has been going on for 40 minutes. So I was saying in the last 15 seconds that the Procurement Act, its application, and too often its misapplication. In the first instance, the application is so much that is right with Jamaica in giving our public and our citizens, you and I, in our private capacities, value for money. And so much that is wrong when it is unfairly applied and when, by virtue of the unfair application, persons who are not qualified, do not have the experience, who may be connected by virtue of political affiliation or actually other kinds of connection, get the contract, and we end up not getting value for money. So that particular act, I urge each of us not just to rely on the Procurement Commission, but to ourselves familiarize ourselves with the terms and conditions of that law. And we mentioned finally one of the most important recent pieces of legislation, and that is the Integrity Commission Act, passed in 2017, but debated for many years prior to that. And the object of this act is exactly to facilitate, to encourage what you and I, what we're talking about in this context of ethical leadership. It is to promote and enhance standards, ethical standards for parliamentarians, public officials, and other persons relating to the prevention of corruption and the award, monitoring, and investigating of government contracts, to promote and strengthen the measures for prevention. So it's not just punitive after the effect, prevention, detection, investigation, and for the first time, prosecution of acts of corruption. Because prior to this, it was only the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions who had that responsibility. Under this law, there's a Director of Corruption Prosecutions who, while being subject to the DPP, has independent authority to prosecute in a context where the investigation reveals that violation of corruption law or procurement law has been committed. So, in brief, we in the public service, senior managers as well as middle managers, cannot only rely on our foundation of traditional values, which we must strengthen, but we have to know the codes and the laws which apply to our particular service and to our particular calling and profession. Regrettably, there are a number of occasions when this application of doing the right thing has not been followed, and we do the wrong thing, either deliberately or unknowingly, because we are not sufficiently familiar with the relevant codes. And I want to now look at a few case studies of wrongs. And then, having done that, we're going to look at the public perception. First of all, nepotism. And I now draw on the Auditor General's report in relation to Petrojam. The reference at the bottom of the page is therefore incorrect. It applies to further case studies, not to this particular one. The Auditor General's report on Petrojam, as you may know, was published in December of 2018. And here is a particular case highlighted in that report. The Human Resources Development Manager also employed her sibling, her relative, in the position of instrument and electrical technician. Although the individual was rejected by the interview panel on May 10, 2017, on the basis of lack of experience and qualification. This engagement, the Auditor General correctly said, was an explicit act of nepotism. The manager HRDA breached Petrojam's employment policy, which prohibits the employment of siblings. Further, the manager HRDA's sibling was shortlisted, although the position was only advertised internally. In both instances, the manager also breached Section 1 of the employment policy, which states that the employment and promotion of an individual will be based upon that individual's experience, qualifications, competency, and potential. How many of us perhaps have had to make some difficult choices, that we have a relative, a friend who is deserving, we regard as deserving, but who does not really measure up in terms of experience, qualifications, competency, and potential. But we decide, in the interest of facilitation, loyalty perhaps misguided to that friend or family, to give them a position over doing the right thing, which is to give somebody else who we may not know, but who has greater levels of competency, qualifications, and experience. So we have to resist nepotism to ensure that we do not commit the kind of wrong identified in this case at Petrojam. Then there's the issue we discussed earlier on of procurement. Once again, the Auditor General's report. Petrojam utilized the direct contracting methodology to award 2 other contracts to consultant 3 for financial and market assessment for US $52,000 plus and financial and future sustainability assessment for $80,000 plus US dollars. Petrojam did not indicate the reason for utilizing the direct contracting methodology for one of the contracts, whilst it also failed to provide details specific to the nature of the contract to justify the use of the exemption clauses. We reviewed the consultancy arrangement for the 2 contracts and found that Petrojam did not obtain any value for US $133,582 it paid for both contracts. Here again, the direct contracting is allowed and can be justified in circumstances set out in Jamaica's procurement rules. However, it is abused and misused when those circumstances do not obtain and when contracts, whether consultancies or otherwise, are awarded without competitive bidding, which is the mechanism that allows us to be confident that we will get value for money from the best bidder in the circumstances. And there are other case studies which we'll want to mention quickly. The recent compendium report by the Auditor General, and we have to celebrate this particular office in Jamaica for continuing to do such good work across administrations. It's not something new, nor are the wrongs we are discussing unique to recent times. In fact, if you went back and looked through the newspapers, you'd see that this has been a characteristic over many, many decades and successive administrations. In this case, what the Auditor General found in looking at the award of contracts and the supervision, the quality oversight provided by the National Works Agency, This was in a report of December 2015. And more recently, the Rural Agricultural Development Authority, the Kingston and St. Andrew Metropolitan Corporation, and the St. Catherine Municipal Corporation. Again, findings that the overwhelming majority of contracts given in respect of road infrastructure were awarded without adequate justification on a non-competitive basis. Again, sometimes there's justification. What the office found is that in the overwhelming majority of cases, this was without justification, and the December 2015 report in particular identifies lack of quality oversight, which allowed for the quality of the work to be less than what would give the public value for money. Two more recent cases which remain controversial, and I recall them for your reflection rather than as cases which are definitively determined by some authority. The question of the award of a mining permit to a company to mine in the Dry Harbor Mountains in St. Anne. Initially, you may recall, the National Environmental Planning Agency, NEPA, the regulatory body in this context, reviewed the application and denied the application for that mining permit, I believe, subject to correction in May of 2020. The company appealed, as it is their right, to appeal against the judgment of NEPA that such a permit would violate Jamaica's right to environmental protection. The appeal was heard, the appeal to the minister was heard, and the NEPA position was modified and the permit granted. One major concern, which I have and put to you for your reflection, because there's no obligation in law, but as many of you know, what is legal may not always be ethical. The appeal was heard without the Jamaican citizens who had been complaining over the years and who NEPA allowed their complaint initially, without them being aware of the appeal process, nor having been invited to make representations in the course of that appeal. Again, as far as I'm aware, no breach of law, but I would certainly wish to propose that transparency and fairness should have led to the citizens who had the complaint being invited in the appeal process to make their submissions, to make their views heard in response to submissions from the company who made the appeal. Subsequently, you may know that the complainants have filed a constitutional action before the courts. It's now being heard. I think the first hearing is later this month, on the grounds that, one of the grounds anyway, that the granting of this permit, despite the revision of NEPA's position being accompanied by some 72 different conditions which the company would now have to fulfill, the citizens' complaint is that the granting of the permit violates a fundamental right which Jamaicans have, not from 1962, but a fundamental right from 2011 with the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, the right to a healthy and productive environment. So I raise this as a dilemma where the law doesn't obligate, but ethical conduct would suggest that the citizens should have been allowed a hearing. Much more recently, and perhaps controversially, and I ask you to revisit if you've done so before, and to take a look if you hadn't, at the Gleaner of December 6, 2020. The headline, muzzled, JCDC reminds staff as the Jamaica Cultural Development Commission reminds staff of the Official Secrets Act amid leaked audit report flagging millions in spending. Now, is this not a clear dilemma? The Official Secrets Act still obtains in Jamaica, despite recommendations over many years that it is archaic and that it undermines, indeed contradicts, one of the fundamental principles of our constitutional democratic arrangements, namely transparency. Equally, the question would be, did the authorities in the Cultural Development Commission remind the staff of the Protected Disclosures Act, which sets out procedures, which indeed encourages disclosure of improper conduct and aims to protect the employees against victimization. This, therefore, is a case that I think would attract much discussion and reflection as to what would be the right thing to do by managers or senior managers, especially in a context where a senior manager or middle manager might be impugned by the audit report. Should it be the case that that level or those individuals should approve contact with the press in a context where there are interested parties? Questions on which I ask you to reflect and to consider, because there seems to be a conflict between law, in this case, the Official Secrets Act, the Access to Information Act, and the Protected Disclosures Act. As senior managers and managers, middle managers, from time to time, I'm sure you'll be able to recount experiences where that kind of conflict may arise, and you have to rely on your ethical foundation, which is the greater good for the greater public, which is the bigger good for more persons, which is in the public interest, to muzzle or to disclose. So, what does all of this mean? The doing the right thing by public servants and sometimes doing the wrongs. I thought I'd bring to your attention a national survey done by Market Research Services Limited That's a Don Anderson polling organization commissioned by National Integrity Action in 2019. And the people were asked, Jamaican people, what are the entities that they feel are definitely involved in corruption? What are the groups they feel are definitely involved in corruption? Politicians came out way above, 73%, followed by the police, 69%, the court system, 43%, and senior public sector people, 29%. And what the chart does not show, senior private sector people, 25%. That's the perception of our people, and we can take some comfort as managers, senior managers and middle managers, that in the view of the Jamaican people, you are among the least regarded as doing wrongs, as behaving in a corrupt way. That is putting personal interest, utilizing position to achieve illicit gain. Internationally, I recall that the 2017 Global Competitiveness Report, it's an annual report done by the World Economic Forum, which is the most prestigious body. It brings together representatives of the private sector, governments, and civil society in Switzerland. And they publish a Global Competitiveness Report, which looks at 140 countries each year in terms of the level of their competitiveness. And it does two other things. It asks and responds to the question, what are the most problematic factors for doing business in a particular country? And they list 16 different factors. Uniformly, Jamaica has listed, or the review of Jamaica has listed corruption as number 3 of the most problematic factors for doing business in Jamaica. And in making that assessment, one of the indicators is favoritism in government and public decision making. And in that 2017 report, we rank number 79, 78 countries doing better than us in terms of favoritism, but also we're above a number of other countries in providing fair awards as distinct from favoritistic decisions in government decision making. So we are not the worst, we're not the best, but given our talent, our capability, and our historical achievement, and our current capacity, we can and must do better. And that includes us, senior and middle managers in the public sector. And therefore, I want to now turn to some recommendations. Going forward, how do we improve in getting it right? How do we acknowledge in practice, not just in words, that the time is always right to do the right thing? Firstly, there is no getting away from deepening your knowledge of the public service, its principles, neutrality, impartiality, anonymity, its principles, the laws and codes and regulations, some of which we have touched on here in this presentation. There is no getting away from that imperative. Jump high or jump low. So much so that at the very pinnacle of one of the 3 branches, co-equal branches of government in Jamaica, we have 3 branches, as you know, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The executive with the recommendation of Prime Minister Holness, has now undergone a significant training in what I've just described. I refer to the release issued a few days ago, I think on February 16th, by the Integrity Commission. The Integrity Commission has completed delivery of a specially developed series of 12 anti-corruption, good governance, and integrity sensitization workshops for Jamaica's Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers. And this was initiated after the election. You may recall the Prime Minister indicating in, I think, in his inaugural address that he proposed to invite the Integrity Commission to do this. And these courses comprehensively were developed between November 9th and delivered on February 15th, ended a few days ago. Each of these sessions lasted between an hour and a half and 2 hours and were delivered to the Cabinet at Cabinet meetings. And they covered the widest range of good governance, integrity, legislation, anti-corruption legislation, the widest range of the foundation of doing the right thing for the executive to be aware of and to comply with. Because as you know, over many years, there have been very many complaints, some legitimate, others not so much, of ministers behaving in a way that's improper, inconsistent with their code of conduct or with the laws and constitution of Jamaica. Since 1990, over the last 30 years or so, there have been 11 ministers on either side, both sides, who have been accused, some, as I said, legitimately, others not so, of impugning the codes of and conduct that should apply. And therefore, at the very pinnacle of the executive, of which the public service is a part, the Cabinet has felt it necessary to undergo this intensive orientation, reorientation workshops on good governance and integrity, sensitization, and anti-corruption. And I commend that. And I do so because I believe that our senior and middle managers need to also deepen their knowledge of the principal laws and codes and regulations which apply in their particular circumstances, including the relationship between the political executive and the permanent public service. Secondly, I urge you, and I recommend most strongly, that you strengthen your resolve to resist the temptation from within, as well as the pressure from outside. Avoid the quest for popularity, whether popularity with friend, with family, whoever. If you did the wrong thing, avoid it and revisit the ethical foundations which come from traditional values, which have been eroded, as I mentioned earlier, and infected in so many ways by contemporary values change. If you look at the regular world values surveys, which are done periodically, you will see that this is not just an anecdote. This is actually borne out by evidence in respect of the global community. Finally, and perhaps most of all, I would like to advocate very strongly the restoration of the Ethics Officers Program. Just as how That program was initiated in 2005 by then Prime Minister Patterson. It was continued by Prime Minister Golding, but has fallen by the wayside. In fact, the Gleaner referred to it in January 3rd, 2006. Government of Jamaica appoints ethics officers, stiffer penalties coming in. The ethics officers, and I believe we got to as many as 100, were basically selected public officers at the senior level in ministries, departments, and agencies who underwent special training beyond the normal average in matters relating to the ethics which apply to the public sector. I remember very well, and I conclude with this recollection, that in July of 2009, that is 12 years ago, the Management Institute for National Development and National Integrity Action Forum, the predecessor to NIA, actually sponsored a workshop at the mine for ethics officers, attended by quite a few ethics officers, and which a number of presentations were made. I recall a presentation made by the Auditor General to that workshop, Pamela Monroe Ellis, and I also made a presentation, and there was a presentation by Ryan Evans, who was then the senior cabinet official responsible for the program. And we each agreed after the workshop that the ethics officers program, far from being allowed to be abandoned, far from being ineffective, needed to be strengthened in ways that were discussed and outlined at the time, by the ethics officers having more authority, being themselves accountable, by their activity being transparent, and in many other ways. I do believe that the environment and the context in which we are now requires not only the pinnacle of the executive, the cabinet, to have specially developed series of the kind I mentioned, but it requires the public sector, managers, senior and middle, to be guided on a continuing basis by ethics officers trained specifically for that purpose and present in ministries, departments, and agencies. I conclude with much optimism and hope. Jamaica is in the midst of a multidimensional crisis, the crisis of COVID-19, the pandemic of violent crime, where murders in the year just gone took the lives of 3 times as many Jamaicans as COVID-19. And we're in the midst of an economic crisis. One impact of which is that public servants like yourselves are not likely to be remunerated in the way that the value of your work should demand and require. But we have been through crises of this nature in the past. And if we come together, subordinate sectional and factional and partisan considerations to the national interest, I'm quite confident that we will be able to come out of this not only stronger, not only to recover stronger, but as I said before, in an article I wrote a couple of days ago in the Gleaner, we must recover with greater effectiveness in combating another virus the inequity virus, which has bedeviled our people and our society for so long in so many ways. I thank you for your patience. I thank you for your consideration. And again, once more, I welcome this opportunity to address a segment of our society, too often unsung heroes, will help Jamaica to be on an even keel, despite many moments. Seas were rocky, and we had to navigate in order to survive, to be where we are today. Thank you very much. I welcome your questions and your comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Monroe. I felt I was at the feet of greatness as I listened to that presentation. It was very, very inspiring, and a lot of knowledge was shared, and we thank you so much for that. At this point, we invite you to ask your questions, and we are going to do this by, if you hover the bottom of your screen, you would see an icon that says reactions or more. Please use the raise hand icon to ask your questions at this point, as well as you can post your questions in the chat, and we will acknowledge those as well. So the floor is open now for questions for Professor Monroe. Please indicate by a raise of hand. There's a question in the chat, okay. Professor, how can the Secrecy Act and the ATI Act continue to coexist? Doesn't the ATI Act effectively annul the Official Secret Act?
May I suggest, Georgia, that we take a couple questions if there are those. So I will monopolize the time less than I did in an hour and 15 minutes ago. So I'd certainly want to address that very important and interesting question raised by that particular individual. But if there are one or two more, then perhaps you could take those and then I try to respond to them together.
Okay, there's another question. At what point does providing employment to relatives and friends, what point is that not nepotism? And there's another question. How do we go about resurrecting the ethics officers and entrenching in our system? And there's yet another one, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, in response to highly publicized corporate financial scandals earlier that decade, was promulgated to address those issues. By comparison, which of the Jamaican legislation or pieces of legislation address those issues similar to the ones addressed by the Sarbanes, not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Oxley Act, 2002.
Okay, perhaps we might address these three very interesting questions, and I thank the persons who raised those issues. How can the Access to Information Act coexist with the Official Secrets Act? The short answer is that they should not, because the Access to Information Act, the very foundation and objectives as set out in the law, run absolutely counter to the Official Secrets Act. And it is for that reason why, over a number of years, the government itself, as I said, under Prime Minister Golden, whose administration, by the way, initiated perhaps more governance reforms than any previous or subsequent one, didn't complete them all because of the way in which that regime ran afoul of ethics in relation to this crisis. But laws such as campaign finance reform, the Independent Commission, INDECOM, the proposal to have fixed terms for prime ministers, the many other proposals were actually introduced by that administration. And this was one of them, to repeal. In fact, Goldman said we want to ensure by the end of 2011 that the Official Secrets Act would be repealed. It was not done. This was reinforced by a Joint Select Committee of Parliament, senators and members of the House, who reviewed the Access to Information Act, because that act required that to be reviewed every few years. And in that review, they reinforced the point that the Official Secrets Act should be repealed. So the short answer is that these can't coexist logically, and therefore what is required is more sustained advocacy by those amongst the citizenry, those within the public sector who may have the opportunity to make recommendations, and Secretary's Board, for example, and politicians of integrity to say, look, once and for all, let's get rid of this law, which the British have amended many times since it was passed in 1911, and which has been repealed in so many jurisdictions. So, short answer to your question, it should not coexist, and we need to ensure by our advocacy that changes are made. Advocacy sometimes takes a very long time in Jamaica. Regrettably, where political will is either fractured, divided, or distracted. And it takes very, very long. The campaign finance regulations were first proposed in 2002. We didn't get them to 2017. So my encouragement is, let's sustain private representations and public advocacy in relation to that matter. The second question, when does employment of relatives and friends not amount to nepotism? I think a fairly short answer, when the friend or relative is qualified for the position and based on merit, experience, potential, the friend or relative can appropriately and properly and ethically be appointed to that position going through the appropriate procedure. So that nepotism doesn't mean that you don't ever employ a friend or relative. It means that when you do, you need to ensure that your personal preference does not overtake the examination of qualifications, experience, and merit. The issue of the ethics officer is a very, very important matter. I intend to raise this in the public domain again, because that program, properly re-examined, reinforced, I think would go a long way to ensuring that our public sector does even better than it is now in doing the right thing, and that it has an even higher standing in the minds of the public than it has now. Recall what the poll showed, that we are regarded as far less susceptible to corruption than so many other important elements of our governance arrangements. So that's what I would suggest. Private representation, public advocacy, and I believe that the recent experience where the cabinet itself and the Prime Minister felt it necessary for them to undergo this extensive, the modules are, I've seen the titles of the modules. In fact, if you look at the release coming from the Integrity Commission, you will see how comprehensive the exposure was during those 12 different modules for an hour and a half to 2 hours each. So quite comprehensive. Of course, we, the public, and the Prime Minister and the Cabinet itself needs to hold themselves to account and help to ensure that what was communicated is actually applied in the everyday discharge of their responsibilities. But it is really a commendable step that this was done and that the Integrity Commission had the possibility of fulfilling that request. The fourth question I wasn't so clear on in relation to, could it be repeated, refer to a law in 2000? I'm not sure where that law was or what it is.
Okay, let me look for that question. So it's by which of the Jamaican legislation or pieces of legislation address those issues similar to the ones addressed by the Sabans Oxley Act 2000.
Remind me, could a question remind me of the Savant-Oxley Act?
The Savant-Oxley Act of 2002, in response to highly publicized corporate financial scandals earlier that decade, was promulgated to address those issues.
So in the UK or in the US?
It doesn't say. Yeah, it doesn't say. So
Well,
to find out which pieces of Jamaican legislation address those issues, similar to the ones in the Savant-Oxley Act.
so in the US, from Prudence James, I see she's telling us that.
Oh yes, the US.
Yes, good. I think that in our case, right now it's being discussed in some circles. Not just the Savant-Oxley Act, but the UK Bribery Act, a very, very strong law which holds to account not just the middle or lower level individuals in a company or a corporation who may be taking or making a bribe, but it holds the pinnacle, it holds the top of the head of the stream to account in regard to that particular offense. In this case, I do not think that we have yet strengthened our legislation to approximate the Savant-Oxley requirements, and we ought to, because as you know, not just Enron, but there are so many other scandals where particularly banks, financial institutions, HSBC, Bank of America, during and subsequent to the 2008 and prior to the 2008 financial crisis, were responsible for unethical conduct, which helped to create a crisis which impacted so many in the United States and as well as beyond. I think our legislation in that regard does need to be strengthened, and it's a matter of some urgency because of the situation in regard to the role of the financial sector in our development and in our economy.
Okay, Prof, there are some follow-up questions to the Nepotism and the Official Secrets Act. The question is being asked, what if the friend or relative got an unfair advantage over others?
One would have to define a little bit what does an unfair advantage mean.
Exactly.
Normally one would look at the advertisement, whether internal or external, would specify the qualities being looked for, the level of qualifications, the extent of experience that the applicant should have, and a question which would require some exercise of discretionary judgment would arise where the friend or relative has relatively equal qualifications, experience, and merit as somebody who is not the friend and relative. Then a discretion would arise in order to exercise that particular decision. Related to this is a very, very important issue which has been pending for too long and which needs to be addressed. It's the regulations to the Public Bodies Management Accountability Act. Minister Clark laid before Parliament under the previous administration prior to September 26, 2020, regulations which would reduce the extent to which persons could be appointed to the boards of public bodies based primarily or predominantly on connections, and increase the proportion. It was established a skills bank in which persons would be asked to register, which are various skills and experience, and a significant proportion of the boards of public bodies would have to be populated by individuals drawn from that skills bank. Secondly, there'd be a limit placed on the number of boards that any single individual could serve on, in particular, chairpersons of boards. And thirdly, there would be a stipulation that a certain proportion of boards would have to span administrations. I recall, I believe it is 1/3 of the composition of any board would be remain across administrations, across ministerial appointments, so that it would take care of a degree of continuity. And secondly, it would also ensure that persons of merit and qualifications and experience would, by virtue of the skills bank, have an obligation and opportunity to serve on the boards, who will of course still have persons appointed on the basis of ministerial discretion, but it would be fettered to deal with some of the matters that have arisen where nepotistic or cronyism has been a major factor in appointing boards, which then don't function in the way they ought to, in particular, not complying with the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, which requires annual reports, financials, and otherwise within 4 months of the end of the financial year. I am unhappy to say that the last tabulation on the Cabinet Secretary's website tells us that of 164 public bodies, only the Bank of Jamaica was in full compliance and current with the requirement to have their annual reports in within the 4 months end of the financial year. Some of them had 11 years out of date. I know in October last year, the Minister of Finance had to issue a circular requiring boards to become compliant. But in that circular, there were no sanctions. And this is a major issue relating to whether we do right or wrong in the public sector.
Okay, there's a question based on the revised constitution. How does one establish that the right to a healthy and productive environment will be impacted prior to the operation of the proposed quarry?
Well, that's a question for the experts, obviously. And I immediately plead not being such. What I can say is that prior to 2011, this would not have been a constitutional issue at all. It would have been an issue concerning the National Development Plan, Vision 2030, which has specific stipulations in there that we should seek to ensure a healthy and productive environment. And in fact, Jamaica is lagging quite a bit on the international survey of environmental protection when last I looked at it. So prior to 2011, this would not be a matter for challenge, or the people who are doing mining would not have to be in accordance with the constitutional arrangements. Now, what we have is a need to be, just as how prior to 2011, an act such as the the NIDS, National Identification Act, would not have been challengeable in the courts. But the 2011 Statute of Freedoms, Fundamental Rights and Freedoms required, and it's a very important change which has not been adequately noticed, that the fundamental rights and freedoms of the Jamaican people, whether to free speech or whether to the environment, healthy environment, can only be infringed, abridged, or violated on the basis of demonstrable justification in a free and democratic society. In other words, there are circumstances which you can justify, but it has to be on the criterion of whether that's compatible with a free and democratic society. And in the case of NIDS, it was ruled not to be compatible. And the case now before the courts in relation to the Dry Harbour Mountain, that's going to be a test to see to what extent the violations, the technical people would assess that the mining has that potential, because the laws, the Constitution doesn't say violated ex post. It says ex ante, threatened to violate your right to free speech and my right to a free and productive, healthy environment. So it's a very, very strong and innovative and appropriate protection of our constitutional rights and freedoms.
Okay, there are just a few more questions. This one's requesting, what is the role of politicians in various ministries? As I find that some normally get involved in the day-to-day activities, which can sometimes lead to ethical dilemmas.
Another one? Any other questions?
Another question is, can freedom of the press and access to information acts pose ethical issues in government?
Good. Very pleased with the quality of the questions and comments being made. There's a code of conduct for ministers. Again, one of the best kept secrets, and I would invite each of us as senior and middle managers in the public service to familiarize ourselves with that code of conduct for ministers, which has been in existence from 2002, which sets out pretty clearly what, at that level, the political directorate should and should not do. Like every other rule, of course, it might be violated from time to time, but it's good to know what the rule says. In that context, I want to refer and at the same time defer to permanent secretaries who may be amongst us in this particular webinar. But I was interested to revisit the rules regarding permanent secretaries, who are the heads of the permanent civil service, the accounting officers in various ministries. And I took a look at the rule regarding, what happens if a minister gives an instruction which the permanent secretary, based on their knowledge and professional expertise, knows to be in violation or in breach of a particular rule or regulation, whether the Financial Administration Act or the Public Bodies Management Accountability Act. What then happens? And I'm seeing where the permanent secretary can say to the minister, Minister, I want you to reconsider this because it really does seem to be violating this particular rule, ethical imperative, or otherwise. If the minister insists, then, as I understand it, the minister needs to put it in writing, and the permanent secretary then has to comply. But the compliance has to be accompanied by an indication of the disagreement that I have complied, but I do not agree, and I've complied because of the instruction that I have received. So that there's a really fine balance between supporting a minister in the fulfillment of policy, which is an obligation of the civil service, on the one hand, and ensuring that the operationalization of policy does not breach relevant statute, codes, or regulations. So that if the politicians, as the questioner puts it, is interfering in various ministries and in terms of operational activity, then this could be well be a basis for complaint to your superior, ultimately to the permanent secretary, for guidance and for advice. Because the political executive is not supposed to get involved into matters of operations, matters of administration. They set policy and you are required to support. Freedom of the press issues, of course, the press itself has to be subject to certain ethical guidelines. It can't just say and do what it wishes without any regard to the appropriate ethical guidelines. And in fact, the Press Association of Jamaica, I know, has supported for some time the importance of having ethics, a code of conduct, which will be self-regulated in the first instance. But what the press should never be afraid of doing is to carry out investigative work, which probes not just public officers and their conduct, but also the private sector. As we often say, one hand can't clap. And one of the things I've been very concerned about is that in the issue of the improper award of contracts, there does not seem to be any provision, and I know the Integrity Commission is now proposing this, where a private business that has been implicated in that improper acquisition of a contract is not sanctioned appropriately. The PSOJ has a code of conduct that should be more widely known. And as the Integrity Commission has recommended, where a contractor is implicated in a way that is colluding with the improper award of contract because he gave a big contribution to a politician or to a political party, he's looking for something in return, then the Integrity Commission is recommended that that particular business contractor ought to be debarred and cross-barred from receiving public contracts for a specific, if not for an indefinite period. That is something I strongly support because the private sector, the private businesses should be held to account to do the right thing and not just the public sector in this context.
Okay, there's just a comment right now that says, I think the sanctions against public servants are more clearly defined and a lot more harsh than the sanctions for politicians. The sanctions against politicians are oftentimes not prescribed and are vague. For example, the line between setting policy and getting involved in the day-to-day running are often blurred, and sometimes they exert undue influences on processes and people. So I therefore think imposing something similar to staff orders for politicians that clearly set out sanctions and to which they can be held accountable instead of applying codes of conduct that are meant to guide behavior without any stated sanctions.
And I applaud that suggestion without hesitation, absolutely. And if you look at the history, ministers in the 10 years before independence, and I really regret to say this, 3 or 4 ministers, I believe it was 3 or 4, yeah, were investigated, charged, prosecuted, and sent to prison in those 10 years. In the years since 1990, 30 odd years since in the last 30 years, 1 minister has been charged, prosecuted, convicted, and sent to prison. 10 others were in the public domain for improper conduct. In one case, it took 6 years for the matter to come to trial. 27 witnesses were heard, and at the end of the day, the judge said no case to answer. In another case, which is in the public domain, so I mentioned it, the Maybe Johnson international firm was indicted in the United Kingdom for bribery in Iraq, Ghana, and Jamaica. In the Jamaican case, the officer concerned was not charged nor brought before the courts and did not have an opportunity to clear his name or to be found guilty before he passed away. So I do believe that there needs to be greater equity in the application of the rule of law in respect of the man in the street, who, if you Google as we speak, just Google, arrested for small crimes. You will see how many have gone to prison and how many others have not, who are credibly accused of major crimes against the state. So there needs to be greater equity, and I do agree with that person that the code of conduct of our politicians should be strengthened to become more regulations along the staff orders, and the courts need to act. In the United Kingdom, where the politicians are allowed to make applications for parliamentary allowances, between 2011 and 2012, the allowances were regarded as being falsified or exaggerated. And somewhere in the region of 4 members of the House of Commons and 3 members of the House of Lords were charged and convicted and had to spend time in prison. We need to improve the equity in the application of the rule of law, which would generate greater respect for the law, greater respect for social order, because it would be regarded as more general in its application. This is not just me saying so. If you look at the 2007 Blue Ribbon Justice Sector Task Force report, chaired by my late colleague, Professor Barry Shavans, and which had Justice Lindsay Wolf was on that task force already, which did extensive interrogation of the justice system. You will see where it is said that one of the strengths of the Jamaican justice system is the confidence of our people in it, but one of its weaknesses is inequitable treatment of the wealthy litigant compared to the rest of the citizenry. That is one area that we need to change. It's part of the inequity virus which infects our body politic, even as we fight the COVID-19 infection.
Okay, thank you very much. That was the last of questions/comments. So really my task at this moment is to move a vote of thanks. Firstly, I would like to thank Dr. Ruby Brown, our CEO, for her opening remarks, setting the context of the webinar and the critical need for discourse on this topic, ethical leadership. I want to also take this opportunity to thank the participants. This is a record number of participants for us in our webinar series, and we thank you for participating as well for your robust questions and your comments. It therefore just leaves me right now to extend thanks to Professor Trevor Monroe. Prof, the insights on various pieces of legislation, such as the Official Secrets Act, the ATI, the Whistleblower Procurement, and so on, are noteworthy. The incorporation of the specific cases of nepotism, contracting were relevant and current and quite useful. We are now armed with a greater understanding and appreciation of the various ethical issues that as public servants we are faced with and we continue to be faced with. Indeed, the time is always right to do the right thing. Your recommendations are of great value, and in particular, the one where you spoke about the need to restore the ethics officers program. Dr. Brown, we certainly need to re-engage in discussion with the National Integrity Action to move this along and bring it back to the fore. Professor Monroe, we thank you for sharing your brilliant mind and for taking the time from your hectic schedule to engage with us. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And may I say, Georgia, if I could rupture your agenda by saying how much I appreciate the initiative taken by Dr. Brown, Ruby, your own management of this program and of this particular webinar. And most of all, like you, I'm inspired and encouraged by the quality of the comments and the precise nature of the questions asked by our middle and senior managers who are participating. I'm encouraged by the number who registered, and I do feel that there needs to be much confidence and hope by our citizenry, given the quality of our public servants. You are a tribute to those who are, and I know that my father and my uncles and my aunt will be smiling where they are to see that their successors have lived up to the integrity that characterized their time, and that you all are committed to doing the right thing, not sometimes, but at all times. Thank you so very much for having me, and I look forward to further collaboration with the mind and with the public service of our wonderful country. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Monroe. And I think I speak on behalf of all of us who are here on this platform that we will be committed to ensuring that at all times we act ethically and we do the right things all the time. At this point in time, we are going to post a link that we are going to ask you in terms of providing feedback about this webinar. The link will be posted in the chat. It has just been posted. We ask you to take just 2 to 3 minutes to complete that survey so we get some valuable information in terms of how to further improve these webinars as we move forward. Once again, thank you very much, participants. Have a great day and enjoy the weekend when it comes. Continue to be safe, continue to adhere to the protocols as we continue to live in these trying times, navigating these changes. But I know we can do it if we just adhere to the protocols. Once again, thank you very much. We keep the lines open for you to continue to provide information via that evaluation link. We have posted it again for those of you who have missed it. Professor Trevor Monroe, thank you very much and do have a pleasant and blessed day.
Thank you once again, and may that apply to all of our participants. I do appreciate their contribution. All the very, very best in these critical times. Keep safe, well. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much.
Yes, I was going to ask if you wanted to say anything at this point.
I can't add. When you have a perfect event, you can't add. Thank you so much, Prof. And everybody who has been on. Really fabulous. Really
I'm so proud of my former students who shall remain nameless.
Okay, thank you very much again, and good.
Yes, we'll be in touch, Prof. All right, good.
Bye.
All right, bye, everyone. Thanks, Georgia.
You're most welcome.
Excellent job as always.
Thank you. Colleagues, remember to complete the evaluation. Your feedback is vital to this process.